welcome to another episode of Transport in Africa, a weekly podcast dedicated to spotlight cutting-edge research, innovations, and ideas shaping transport systems across Africa. I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. In each episode, we sit down with a researcher, practitioner, or change maker who is redefining how mobility works in Africa. In today's episode, we are focusing on street designs in Africa. Streets are more than just spaces for movement. They are also the socio-economic arteries of community life. Yet, in many African cities, street designs often prioritize vehicles over people, leaving pedestrians, cyclists, and informal users at the margin. Our discussion today sheds light on what it means designing streets that serve people and not only cars. We will explore lessons, challenges, and opportunities for creating safer, more inclusive, and vibrant urban spaces. Joining me for this discussion is Gashaw, a transport professional at the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, ITDP Africa. He brings deep experience working on projects related to people-centered street designs and sustainable transportation in Africa. Hello, Gashaw. Good to have you on this show.
Thank you so much, Chebe. It's good to have this second discussion with you, and I'm happy to be on your platform. Thanks.
Once more, I'm happy to have you for the second time on the show. So before we get into the conversation proper, could you once more tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and your experience working on street designs and urban mobility projects across Africa?
I'm Gashaw. I'm currently working with ITDP Africa. I'm the active mobility manager for the Africa team. So I've been working in ITDP for the past 7 years. My work primarily focuses actually on sustainable urban mobility projects, including the developments of the urban street design manual for different cities, formulating non-motorized transport strategies, developing sustainable urban mobility plan for some of the secondary cities. Particularly in Ethiopia, we have cities like Bahar Dar and also in other cities as well in Africa. Been also working on a lot of bike share studies, mostly on the financial model and the feasibility study. So most of my works are also based in Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Egypt, Tanzania, Zambia, and Ghana, where ITDP has active projects. So more or less that's me. Before joining ITDP, I used to work also for the Addis Ababa City Master Plan Bureau as a team leader for transport and road network. So that's where my passion on street designs and then the overall transportation starts from.
Interesting to hear how far you have come as far as street designs are concerned. Gashaw, across Africa, cities are rapidly expanding, and the way we design our streets has a huge impact on how people live, move, and interact. From your perspective, what does a well-designed street look like, and why does it matter for everyday urban life?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's what we actually put in our street design manuals. Like, what do we mean by a well-designed or an inclusive street or a complete street, and some are calling it. So it needs first to give priorities for, like the pedestrians, cyclists, as well as people using public transport, and not only just for cars. So it needs to prioritize safety, and it also needs to give accessibility, which we have mentioned during your opening speech. So when you were talking about urban streets, you have talked about accessibility, which is the most important thing. And also it needs to be comfortable for all road users. So that includes pedestrians, cyclists, and also the car users. So features like this, so which we focus in our street design manual to include, like wider side walkways, a safe pedestrian crossing, preferably a raised one, or sometimes we not only to depend on, like a painted pedestrian crossing. So when you talk about safety, so a street design that includes, like some of these road safety elements, as well as the different street features on it. So that's what we call a well-designed street. So it needs to accommodate the needs of every user, not just for cars.
Thank you very much for that brief background. Gashaw, many streets in African cities struggle with issues such as limited pedestrian space, poor drainage, and weak integration between transport modes. What are some of the key planning or design mistakes cities should avoid when rethinking inclusive streets?
So it's not just one or two things, but there are several things, yeah, that cities needs to avoid. Some of the key mistakes, especially, is neglecting the pedestrians and cyclist needs. So that's obviously a major issue that we have seen in most of our cities. And also, we sometimes also underestimate the importance of having a good drainage system, because that's also well aligned. We know on how we're working in our streets, even on how we're using the carriageway for cars. So it affects the design that we do for our drainage system, also directly affects the overall mobility because of the floods, or underestimating the capacity of the drainage system itself. So there are so many things that needs to be done, but like as a major issue that we face is what type of street designs are cities using. So that's how ITDP was trying to tackle some of the challenge. For example, where I'm based here in Ethiopia. So we've observed, like different street types. Like for example, some streets you could see them having wide walkways and good quality shades and everything. And there are many of the streets also with no walkway or limited space with no furnitures on it. So one thing that we noticed was like there is no, like that urban street design manual that cities are using, because urban streets needs to have a different feature from this highway streets. So whatever street design manual that we are using at our cities, we thought that the cross section and the profile of the streets needs to change. For example, from the overall street width, some like a large portion of it usually goes for carriageway, right? So depending on the location of the streets, this has to be changed. So ITDP has developed urban street design manual for Kenya, for Rwanda, as well as in Ethiopia. For the one in Ethiopia, it's almost like applicable now. Like the cities are trying to use some of the standards there. You know as well, these highway manuals or existing urban street manuals that cities are using, walkways are given limited space. Cycle track is no longer there in most of this manual. So the change in the street design manual is the first and the most important thing when we talk about the mistakes that we need to avoid. And yeah, in terms of construction also, we need to take care, like about the quality and the specific details, including inclusion of tactile pavements or putting ramps or detail elements that we miss in our streets. Yeah, those are the things like construction that we need to focus more on the bit of details to create comfort and safety. So they need to have certain standards that they use to help them, like create that room first on your design and show like how you could distribute your 40-meter streets, 30-meter streets, and how many of the space from that should be going to walkway and cycle tracks, as well as other elements, including the carriageway. So we're not saying avoid carriageway. And also don't underestimate the importance of including mass transport elements on it, like the BRT and dedicated space for public transport is also quite important. And reimagine of your streets as if you're planning to move people on that street, not cars. Always give a message. So we said we're moving people, not cars. So that's why the need to have also a dedicated space for public transport like BRT would come into picture. Audience have the chance to review, for example, they could visit some of the websites of ITDP, try to see some of these street design manuals, and you could see how it's different from what the highway manuals are reflecting, because we've included, like quality space and wider space for pedestrians, cyclists, as well as public transport. So
Hey, Gashaw, you mentioned something, and I would love you to throw more light on it. That's the difference between highway manuals and urban street manuals.
sure. For the discussion on the needs for pedestrians and cyclists, there were a lot of street design manuals in some of our African cities that are currently being used to develop our streets. And the outcome of these manuals is clearly reflected in our streets. So, for example, you see most of our streets in wherever we're based in Africa, like most of our streets, we're doing a lot of good job in increasing the density of the road. And then the only thing that we're focusing there is mostly for cars, right? Like we're increasing the carriageways, but we tend to have road spaces that are limiting space for pedestrians, and we usually don't even have the cycle tracks in our streets. So that's the major cause of that, is because the design manuals that are existing now in most of these cities is drafted from highway manual. So those manuals were prepared, like to move cars from A to B, from origin to destination, instead of considering the need for pedestrians and cyclists, and also the safety element of it. And usually the design speeds are also some of the discussions that we have in these two manuals. So when we compare the design speed for highway, it needs to be different from the design speed that we are introducing for urban streets, because urban streets requires, like a slower speed, and also the safety issue. So that's why you notice like not only the infrastructure issue, but a lot of traffic crashes happening in African countries are because we're providing multiple lanes of road in our streets without no proper pedestrian crossing and no even enough space for pedestrians. So that's caused because of the manuals that we're using for highways. I'm not saying that highways are not important, but they should be used, like to connect different cities, and the profile that you used for those type of streets do not need to be used also in urban areas. So that's the most important message, especially in the CBD and central areas. So we don't want cars to, like to speed up. So that there should be, like some speed calmings, and there are some, to begin with, there should be a distribution of space between cars, pedestrians, and cyclists, and also public transport. And then there are features like pedestrian crossing, and also the way you treat your intersection also really matters on the safety of the streets. So those elements needs to be changed. So what makes this urban street design manual different is it gives a lot of attention on these elements, like the introducing the mass transit elements on it, wider walkways, protected cycle tracks, not just a painted and just a marker cycle tracks, but a protected one. And then also still keeping also enough space for cars, like we are still using some of the space in the street design manual to move cars on the city. So those are the main differences.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Just to add that highway designs are there to convey traffic between cities, while for urban street designs, they are there to serve a large number of users, that's cyclists, pedestrians, and equally car users. Public acceptance and participation are crucial in street design projects. How can city authorities and designers better engage communities, including informal traders, transport operators, and vulnerable groups, to create more inclusive and functional streets?
Yeah, that's the most important question. Yeah, like community engagement on every planning process is very important, especially on the street design as well, because there are events like, for example, the car-free days and placemaking activities, especially in Nairobi. Recently, we've done some placemakings alongside with UN Habitat. That gives, a chance for the local dwellers and citizens to just engage, like in some street activities. So not, the planners and architects and the engineers are not the only ones that are the owner of the streets, right? Even though they are directly engaged in this construction or design, whatever case, but the design element should come from the residents. So most of these urban street design manuals that I was mentioning to you usually reflects, like the need of the people. Like they know what type of space that needs to be created. So there are different techniques. I started with car-free days. So car-free days are important just to reflect, like how roads should be used. It could be on the weekend or it could be on one day per month. So cities needs to adapt that in different areas along their city. In Addis Ababa, for example, there are 12 different sites in the capital city. Like every Sunday, it would be closed for cars, and like children will go out to the streets and start drawing on it and then show their arts and work. Even for elderly and disabled, so they will also get the chance to like to utilize some of these busy streets. So on a regular day, some of these streets are very busy, but in during car free days, they will get the chance to see and explore, like how that could be changed. Sometimes also we use tactical urbanism, for example, in streets where we want to convince the decision makers. So you can engage the community team or and start producing some designs. Like you can pick one specific streets and then you can ask the community like what needs to come on the streets, right? So you can ask them for example, to increase the walkway. So they could use just painting on the streets by just doing, we call it tactical urbanism. So these are also very important tool. So, and yeah, previously there has been so many tactical urbanism works that has been done, especially by GDCI. There is an intersection improvement that had happened here in Addis in 2014 or 2015. So those had helped, like first you can notice some of the movement will change. Like for example, car users, they will not step on the paint because they will see like maybe it's an important thing. So you can take more space from cars and introduce it to the pedestrians, right? So those type of an interaction between the government and this partner agencies as well as the community, they could do their exercise themselves. So street design could be more inclusive when you do it like that, instead of like just dictating and then come up with some implemented roads and then invite people for the opening. So you can also engage them, trying to see like how what they think of how they should be transformed their streets. I think there are different techniques that you could use. So organizing several workshops is also important with local representatives. You cannot have access maybe for each and everyone, but at least you will have a community leaders or and the community members that are directly involved, like in this type of activities.
Gashaw, some African cities such as Addis Ababa, Kigali, and Cape Town are often cited for their people-centered street transformations. However, there are still street design issues in these cities. Based on your experience in recent street assessments in Addis Ababa and Kigali, what lessons can African cities draw from their successes and failures?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. And I would say there's no like one direct answer that would apply for every African countries. As I've mentioned, like each country and each city have, even within one country, different cities have different characters, political system, and administration. So this street design starts first, like the commitments in terms of making sure having a good quality street design manual in our city. So if, for example, Addis has done it and then they have implemented, like more than hundreds of kilometers of quality walkways and cycle tracks, and people is using it as an example, just in a short period of time. Same thing Kigali was doing it a while ago, like with its car-free zone areas, like where they just give a lot of emphasis for pedestrians and cyclists instead of cars. So they closed some major streets and then transform it to more of a pedestrian zone. And yeah, there are not only Addis and Kigali, but there are different cities that are also striving for it. But one thing that's tackling them first is the manuals or the designs. That's not there in place first to be used, because they're using an existing manual that gives emphasis for cars instead of pedestrians and cyclists. So that needs to change in most of our streets. So we need to focus and start developing this urban street design manual, because that's very important. Second, there should be also, we need to have at least a commitment from the political side and administrative side. That's also very important. So we need to have a champion and someone that you could, like take as a, either from the transport sector or from the urban planning sector. There should be some higher official that owns this transformation. Because me and you, we are discussing about the benefits of having quality walkway and cycle tracks. All officials and the government officials, they know the same. Most of our streets are becoming, instead of moving people, they are killing most of our young and productive generation because of the road safety issues. So the first, they need to clearly understood that transforming the streets is not only like to create a beautiful space, but a safer space. And it also facilitates your economy, right? So if you move freely in your city and then, like avoid congestion and start developing, like start to move around things faster, then directly your economy also will start to develop. So there are so many targets, right? Like through environment as well. So if the more clean and neat streets that you have that focus on public transport, walking and cycling, so the more the healthy environment that you will have in your city. So we notice like in some of these areas where the cycle tracks, although we need to measure the air quality in these areas, but we have witnessed, like at least there is a change in the overall environment in these areas, and people also feel safe to walk around and work and to go to school and stuff. So start with the design, as I've said. Second, political commitment is mandatory. It's important. You need to have a good decision making process and also commitments from the government. And the third, yeah, there should be also some way, like the previous question that you raised. So there should be also some mechanism to hear directly from the community on what they need and start implementing based on that. So that will give you also the actual answer what needs to be done in your streets.
As African cities embrace concepts like sustainable transport, walkability, and electric mobility, how do you see the role of street design evolving over the next decade?
Yeah, I think we will likely see a shift towards more of a good functioning street that incorporates, like both the public transport component of it. So when we talk about electric mobility as ITDP here, also we tend to focus more on e-buses and electric two and three wheelers. So yeah, they are directly related. So every mods that we're trying to introduce or suggest to our city, they have to use streets, right? When we talk about street design, we still give priority for pedestrians, cyclists, but the importance of electric mobility, especially the new wave that we have on electric mobility, also it's an important thing that should be focused. I mean, in terms of while designing our streets. So, but either ways, while designing the streets, so the basic principles that I have mentioned to you, including walking, cycling, and also space for public transport. So some of these e-buses or the electric mobility initiatives that we're introducing, they will have like a good space to be used efficiently in the city when we provide them a dedicated space. So that's why some of these street design manuals currently they reflect still like having a median space to be used for a BRT, so which is the EBRT now. Like Addis Ababa now is starting its BRT project this year. By next month, the first BRT corridor will start the construction. And but we have also the cases in Dakar, which is an existing EBRT is operating. And the Sustainable Transport Award from last year was also for Dakar. So that's a good example from Africa that could be used as an example for either for Addis or any other city that wants to achieve a good electric public transport mobility. Same thing in Dar es Salaam. They're also doing a lot of job in public transport improvements. So they also have been one of the major city that we always envision to have, right? Like with its good public transport BRT system on it. So there are cases like these e-mobility discussions. Also, first we need to focus more on e-buses and E2 and three wheelers that would support the cycling, and still going to accommodate them because they are still keeping space for public transport in our streets. So it goes one way or another.
Gashaw, based on your experience working on street designs across many African cities, what advice will you give to planners, policymakers, and street design engineers who want to make streets more people-centered and equitable, especially in resource-constrained environments?
Thanks, Jube. Yeah. So the traditional way of the planning and the construction of the streets has helped, like whatever we're using now is because the traditional system has been working at some point. Like at least it's moving people, like even though that we're not provide, even though the critics are too much, like we don't give any emphasis for pedestrians and cyclists previously, but we're still, like have those streets that are already on the ground that has been used. But we also need to consider like we cannot continue to work with the same traditional way of developing streets, which is giving more space for cars and having more lanes in our streets. So whenever there is a need to transform streets, like most of the African cities focus on increasing the number of lane for cars and not, like having quality walkway or cycle track. But that doesn't like we have seen the circle, like the more space that you accommodate, then more cars will come to the street. So more space for cars, and then more congestion into our city, and also more traffic crash. So that circle should stop somewhere. And some cities have already decided, right? So you can take your options, like go through whatever you're doing now and start, like building more roads for cars and introduce more crash into your city, or start thinking about moving people instead of cars and use your space or your streets in a complete way that gives emphasis, like at the beginning of your question, I think you were talking about what makes a well-designed street, right? So it's a well-designed street, or we call it complete street, needs to move people efficiently. So we have done a lot of studies before, especially like having a street with a protected space for, or a median with a BRT could move, like thousands of people. And instead of, like allocating more space for cars, you could efficiently use your road space to accommodate space for public transport, but you could still move a lot of people on that corridor, same corridor, even more than the ones that you're moving through using private cars. So that way you could, like solve the case of road safety. You could use your space efficiently in terms of economic impact as well. Having, like such type of a complete streets, it would have a lot of impact, like economic impact in a positive way. And then you will reduce, like the burden in terms of the road safety issues as well as the climate change and everything, so that we always want to address. So taking the responsibility of thinking outside of the box and start working on these urban street design manuals is quite helpful. So the traditional way had worked, but we have seen it and we have observed that it's not going to continue like this, because that's not what people also think. So we need also to engage more involvement from the residents and the community, as you have mentioned earlier. And then you will see there what people need, whether they need a carriageway or whether they need a safer space for their children to walk and cycle. So that's the most important thing. So the planners and engineers, my advice is to rethink of our streets and think of the urban streets different from the highways and the traditional way of designing our streets.
Gashaw, before we wrap up this conversation, is there anything else you would like to share, perhaps about your current project, future priorities, or a final message for our listeners interested in creating people-centered streets in Africa?
Yes, sounds good. So maybe I could just say a bit about the ITDP's role in some of our cities. So in terms of our work, ITDP has a target, supporting different cities across the world. So one thing we want to focus is also increase the public transport users in different cities. So that's one of our strategies. So we will be collaborating with different partners. When we talk about increasing the ridership for public transport, we're also trying to see the last mile connectivity, and also still continue on the active mobility side of it, where we want to improve the walking and cycling facilities in different cities, as well as electrification wise. We also want to see how electric public transport as well as electric 2 and 3-wheelers would support the different cities that we're working with. So basically that, and the third one is more or less, we're also trying to support different cities, how they could, get the funding to support their implementation, like implementation of whether it's a public transport project or an MD project. So that's basically what we're trying to do here.
That brings us to the end of this episode of your podcast on transport in Africa. Gashaw, thank you very much for accepting to share your insights on street designs in African cities. I wish you all the best in your professional journey.
Thank you so much, Jevin. It was always nice talking to you, and thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, please consider subscribing to our page. You can also contribute by sharing this podcast with friends and colleagues who are interested in transport and mobility issues in Africa. If you are a researcher or practitioner working on transport in Africa and would like to share your work on this platform, feel free to reach out to me at chebechesifu@campus.technion.ac.il, and we can discuss how to feature your work on this show. Until next time, I am your host, Polycarp Chebe. Thanks for listening and